My name is Mark Kindruchuk. I'm with Intermarket Developments. I'm also the co-chair of this year's ULI Symposium. I'm here with Leslie Wu. We want to thank you for attending today. Yesterday was very successful. I hope you get a chance to go to all the sessions as well. The virtual reality room is still open today from 9 to 3, so if you get a chance, go in there. And there's 4 different companies, so if you saw one yesterday, you can see a few more today. We have a very full agenda with the ULI programming in the morning, City of Toronto this afternoon. So we want to get started and have Leslie introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mark, and also thanks to my other co-chair, Cindy Rottenberg-Walker. The three of us have had a lot of fun organizing and curating the conference. Yesterday morning, around this time, many of you would have met David from IBI, and I'm going to welcome him up in a second. But first of all, to thank IBI for second year in a row being a ULI Symposium major sponsor. So round of applause. And with that, I'm going to introduce David. Come on.
Thank you, Leslie and Mark. Good morning. It's my pleasure to launch day 2 of ULI's Toronto Symposium by introducing Richard Florida, this morning's keynote speaker. Richard Florida is one of the most influential urbanists of our time, which means he really doesn't need an introduction. And that's good, because Mark prodded me just as we were getting up here that time's tight and we got to get the ball rolling. 15 years ago, Richard published The Rise of the Creative Class, which profoundly shaped our thinking about cities and influenced public policy, our design responses, that has shaped cities themselves as they have re-urbanized over the past 1.5 decades. But caution flags have been raised in his new book, The New Urban Crisis. This is a book that has many of the ominous undercurrents of the dark age ahead by the late Jane Jacobs. But it offers up hope, cautious hope, through the compelling advocacy position which he refers to as inclusive urbanism. The New Urban Crisis is a call to action that all of us would do well to heed. We are very fortunate to have Professor Florida with us today, his first public appearance in Canada since the release of his book just 2 weeks ago. And with that, I will invite Richard to the stage.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you to Richard, to this incredible staff and the board of this incredible ULI chapter. And I know the ULI very well. In fact, I addressed the board recently, and one of the great things about a book launch when you have friends at the ULI is the ULI always brings out people to book launches no matter where you go, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Columbus, Indianapolis. So they've been our partner on book launch events all throughout Canada and the United States. They always bring out a great crowd, but I'll tell you, this chapter is really recognized, not only for its fast ascent as a district council, but for its incredible programming. And I've been tracking your progress holy God, where was I yesterday? No, I was not in Atlanta yesterday. I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan yesterday. And I was tracking this conference and this event on social media, and boy, you are just really killing it. I think my message is one of cautious optimism and one of great opportunity. And I actually think, by way of preface, and to make this speech very short, when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, there was a glimmer of hope. And I think Toronto had more of this, because Canadian cities and Toronto never really hollowed out the way US cities did. There was a glimmer of hope in many of our eyes, you know. Think about Jane writing back in the 60s about the death and life of great American cities and the way cities were being hollowed out and everything was moving out to the suburbs, people, money, affluence, business jobs. I think there was a glimmer of hopes that cities could be revived. And in that 15-year period, and it's very interesting, only because it has nothing, by the way, it has nothing to do with me or Rise of the Creative Class, only because I was picking up signals as I visited cities, and when I'll talk more about it, went to work in cities and talked to mayors and urbanists and urban leaders and developers. I could see that the urban revival was coming. I don't think anyone would have predicted the depth of that urban revival, the force of that urban revival. If that could happen, if Detroit could come back, if Pittsburgh could, where I lived for 17 years, could now be seen as a model of urban revitalization, as Newark, New Jersey, my boyhood hometown now is beginning to see young people move back in. If that can happen, that was the harder part. Beginning to make the shift of the next decade or the next 15 years from the kind of winner-take-all urbanism we have today to a more inclusive urbanism and prosperity can be accomplished. I have no doubt about that. Because if cities have revived, if they've attracted people back, if they have revenues and resources, if they have talent and industry and ambition, we can do this. There's no doubt in my mind, but that has to start now. And what's great and good fortune is it is starting now. I see this in every city I visit. I see this in my conversations with mayors. I see this in my conversations with developers. Let's call developers part of anchor institutions, meds and eds and real estate developers. I see this in my conversations with CEOs. There is, in fact, yesterday in Ann Arbor, we had a delegation of people for the International Association of Science Parks. The economic developer who gave me my first speaking engagement when he was in Toledo, Ohio, my very first speaking engagement when I was in my 20s, said to me, "We've failed." The former city planning director of Washington, D.C. said to me, "I failed." And I said, "No, you didn't. You didn't fail." And the reason they said they failed is no matter what they tried, the development remained exclusionary. It remained divisive. I said, "No, you didn't. You helped make this shift to a kind of better urbanism. Making the next shift is going to require all of our work together, but it can be done." So I was born in 1957, a long, long time ago, in Newark, New Jersey. When I was a kid, think about this. When I was a kid, Newark, the poster child of urban economic decline, was a vibrant, thriving city. I was born in the Italian-American district overlooking the city's great Branchbrook Park, much like our great park, where the cherry blossoms were bloom, where I learned to sled, where my dad taught me to skate. By the time I was about 9 or 10 years old, that city was beginning to decline. I've seen cities when they were up. I've seen them when they were down. I've seen them rise again. And one hot July day, my dad was taking me to the Newark Public Library. I wanted to play guitar. I wanted to be a musician. My dad loved music. He loved jazz. He loved big bands. He only had a 7th grade education. He couldn't afford to be a musician. And he said, "Richard, if you're going to be a guitar player, you're not just going to play rock and roll. That's great. You like the Beatles, and you like the Stones, and you like Jimi Hendrix. That's good. But you're going to learn music." So, of course, he found me an Italian, who else would he find? An Italian-American jazz guitar teacher, Mickey Vest, who really schooled me in guitar playing, and I hated it. And we were driving from Newark to my guitar lesson. And I heard shots ring out. Bang, bang, bang. And my dad said, "Richard, get down on the floor." And Newark, my home, had exploded in race riots. There were not only police and police vehicles and police, there were armored vehicles. There were tanks. There were National Guards in the street. As we drove through the street, we could see the fires along the city's commercial zones. We could see the smoke rising out of the neighborhoods. And I didn't know it at the time. I was only a 10-year-old kid, but I was seeing the original urban crisis in real time. I was seeing what happened when our cities were emptied of economic energy, when the white flight to the suburbs, when industry began to move out, when cities became colonies of lower income, disadvantaged, and minority people who were exploited and suppressed. I think I wanted to know why. Not many years later, 1975, New York was pronounced bankrupt. My parents had moved to a small working-class suburb called North Arlington, and on the bluff in that suburb, which bordered the Hudson River, you could see the great towers of New York City, a place I never visited until I was in my late teens. That city was declared arguably the greatest city in the world, the most economically powerful city in the world, declared bankrupt, and the President Ford at the time said to the city, "Go drop dead." I think these events imprinted a kind of care and intellectual curiosity about cities into my DNA. I went off to Rutgers College. I got a scholarship. I was lifted out of a very tough Italian-American, Irish-American, Jewish-American little bit mafia. You guys know my New Jersey accent. I don't have to do that too much for you. But the little bit mafiosa neighborhood where I grew up in New Jersey, actually, the Sopranos were modeled, extracted kids I grew up with. I think I wanted to understand urbanism. I went off to college to Rutgers. My parents wanted me to be a doctor. I'm like, that's not going to happen. I'm not very good at science. I got straight C's. They called a family meeting. They literally called a family meeting where they tried to convince me to be a dentist. I'm like, that's not going to work. My handshake. I was very smart. I said, I should be a lawyer, to which my mother said, lovely Italian woman, said, yeah, Richard, you'd be a good lawyer. You're a good talker, just like me. But I got the bug. And the bug hit me when I was a sophomore in college, when my professor at the time said, take the Amtrak train from New Brunswick. New Brunswick is only about 30 miles, 30, 45 minutes from New York City. It was a commuter suburb. Actually, it had hollowed out and had its own urban crisis. Take the train to New York and go for a walking tour, basically from the Flatiron. Start at the Flatiron building and then walk through the Flatiron neighborhood, Gramercy, go down through Chelsea. Chelsea was nothing, just a burned out mess. The meatpacking district was a functional meatpacking district. There was no yuppies and Sex in the City and restaurants and Apple stores. It was a meatpacking district, no great hotels, boutique hotels. And then continue on. Go through Greenwich Village and Soho and Tribeca. And here I was, a 18, 19-year-old kid with eyes agog. I thought cities were dead. I thought cities were like my Newark. But here I could see something, some kind of energy, some kind of electricity. Something was happening in New York that I couldn't, but I said, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to study. It was just in me. I saw intellectuals around NYU. I saw bohemians. I saw artists and punks and people with strange mohawk hairdos. I saw people clad in black walk. I saw where Soho was still a manufacturing zone, but artists were squatting and galleries opening. I couldn't believe it. I was beginning to see an urban revival. And I went and pursued a PhD at Columbia University. In the 1980s, I saw it happening in real time. I saw the music movement and the art movement. And New York began to attract people. It was an exciting place. I wanted to make sense of it. And then I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where the idea for Rise of the Creative Class came from. Because in Pittsburgh, a place that had been buffeted by the deindustrialization, the same deindustrialization that cost my father his job in his factory in Newark as that factory shuttered in the late 1970s, had buffeted Newark and Detroit and Pittsburgh even more. Pittsburgh saw the annihilation of tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs in steel, in heavy industry, in chemicals, in all sorts of it. It was the Silicon Valley of its day. It lost. Population shrunk from 900,000 in the city to 350,000. Think about that kind of population loss. It had great universities like Carnegie Mellon, where I taught at the time. It was producing technology, but that technology was not sticking. It was not reviving like San Francisco or Boston. That technology was moving away. The talented professors I worked with in computer science, in artificial intelligence, and also internet search were all leaving, not only to go to great universities, but to go to Apple and Microsoft and Google. My students, all to a person, were leaving Pittsburgh. And The Rise of the Creative Class was a book about Pittsburgh and about what communities needed to do to harness the urban revival. 3 T's. I made those 3 T's for my mom. My mom said, Richard, you have to be successful. You've got to apply yourself. You have to excel at the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Surprisingly, they're actually not 3 R's. My 3 T's are actually T's. Technology, talent, and tolerance. You have to invest in technology. It's not enough just to invest in technology. You can build incubation and acceleration and technology startup, but it can go away, just like in Pittsburgh. You have to invest in attracting and retaining talent. But talent, too. I said the biggest export at the time of Pittsburgh was not steel. It was the talented and creative kids Pittsburgh was creating and attracting to its universities. And you had to be tolerant. And, of course, Canada Toronto figured very heavily in that, because I saw that places that were tolerant and open-minded, that treated men and women fairly, that treated gays and straights and singles and families fairly, that didn't recognize ethnic or racial boundaries. And I pointed out that half of the businesses founded in the San Francisco Bay Area were founded by, let's call them, new Americans. A phrase that is finally catching on in the United States, by the way. That places that had larger concentrations of gays and bohemians actually had higher rates of innovation and economic growth. But that was the year 2002. And in that book, I got the glimmers of the urban revival. I went to visit former mayor of DC, African-American mayor, Tony Williams. I agreed to sit on the board of his new policy shop, a brilliant mayor. And he pointed to my book. He had a shelf, and he said, with great wit and humor, because DC has seen this urban revival as much as anywhere. Remember, this was a city that itself engulfed in riots, that was down in the dumps, that had been abandoned except for one or two neighborhoods, that has come roaring back and has been completely remade. The creative class is nearly 50% of the metro and probably 80% of the city's population. And he said, Florida, we followed your playbook, and you, I'm not going to use the exact word he used, but let's say he said, you effed us up. And I said, Mr. Mayor, you're going to like my new book. But we all saw it, not just me. We all see this. We all live this. The urban revival, according to the statistics collected by my brilliant young colleague at the University of Toronto, recruited from Brown University, Nate Baum-Snow, the urban revival across Canada and the United States begins in the year 2000. That's when it begins, and the acceleration of this urban revival, of course, which went on in pockets in Toronto and pockets in Vancouver and pockets in New York and pockets in Seattle, but we're talking large-scale urban revival across many metros and many cities, hundreds. It begins in the year 2000. It accelerates through 2010, and as people, young, affluent, talented people, are drawn back to cities, to be near the core, to be near jobs and economic opportunity, to be near amenity, to be around knowledge and research institutions like the University of Toronto, like MIT, we can go on and on, around great amenity, the coastlines of Los Angeles, the great lake and mountain districts, around subways and transit stops to mitigate their commutes. That's when it goes on. Now, I was thinking about this in the year 2003. 9 months after Rise of the Creative Class was published, I wrote an article in the Washington Monthly. I remind people this is well before the Occupy movement, well before Thomas Piketty wrote his book on the 1%. I pointed out that the most creative economies, the most innovative economies, the densest and largest metros were also the most unequal. But it wasn't until I moved to Toronto that I was forced to confront the reality of the new urban crisis, because I, like Jane Jacobs, came to our urbanist nirvana. I was coming to the place that excelled at tolerance, that was accepting, that in the eyes of Americans, maybe not our eyes, was building, 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 had more cranes in the sky. We have our own NIMBY problems that we know about, but according to Americans was overcoming NIMBYism. We have our issues on transit, I'll get to those, but in the eyes of American urbanists was a leader on transit, a place where there is virtually an absence of violent crime, where there is health care for all, where there is a social safety net that mitigated the kind of economic anxiety that resulted in the election of George W. Bush. And guess what happens? As I step into urbanist nirvana, I'm working at the time with Mayor Miller and Kyle Ray on an inclusive prosperity agenda for affordable housing, investment in transit, upgrading the jobs of service workers, and barely got our foot in the door of Toronto, then into the office of mayor steps our great gift to the world's nighttime comedians and humor, Rob Ford. Talk about culture shock, cognitive dissonance. How could this happen in Toronto? How could this be? This is the place of urbanist, progressivist nirvana. This is the place we point to when this is where Jane Jacobs moved, after all. And therein started the real introspection. Trying to grapple with, intellectually, humanistically, where this came from. And, you know, it wasn't hard when you have brilliant colleagues at the University of Toronto like David Holchansky, or the young political scientist who's now left the University of Toronto, Zach Taylor. It isn't hard to figure out where this came from. It was the backlash. It was the backlash to the very urban revival we all want and I championed. It was the backlash as people looked at the rise of an urban elite, a creative class, knowledge workers, packed in and around the core, around those knowledge institutions, around the subway and transit stops, with everybody else pushed further and further and further afield. And that's when I knew I had to dig in. And this book is the product of 7 years of work, stimulated. If Newark got me interested in urbanism, if Pittsburgh produced Rise of the Creative Class, it's Toronto that made me make this next shift. By the way, I'm always late to the party. Jane Jacobs, if you do read Dark Age, which is a prescient book, massively criticized at the time it was written, by the way, and seen as the work of an aging kind of crank. Prescient about what would happen, how the pillars that held up our modern democratic society were falling apart. She talks about, in that book, Toronto's new urban crisis. She says it. Toronto is beginning to experience, this is in 2004, a new urban crisis, a shortage of affordable housing, a shortage of transit. If this doesn't get, if people don't begin to deal with this, this is going to metastasize. She saw it more than a dozen years ago. I came late to the party. But I said I went out on a limb. I did call Mayor Ford the most anti-urban mayor in world history. I did go out on a limb. I'm an American. I have a big mouth. But I also said Rob Ford was a signal to the world. A signal, and honestly, he was Toronto's signal. Rob Ford was a benign version of populism. As much as I disagreed with him on bike lanes and the crazy Ferris wheel and all of that, he was a benign, in many ways, it's misunderstood, he was a multicultural and multi-ethnic version of populism. He didn't draw racial divides. It wasn't simply about the white working class. He had New Canadians as part of his coalition. But I could have never anticipated the Brexit. And I said to my friends, oh my God, with Rob Ford in Toronto and the Brexit, the Americans will never be crazy enough to elect Trumpy. And of course, we had the Americans in the neighborhood. We had our election night party. We had our giant statue of Hillary, our little baby and dog dressed in red, white, and blue, ready to have uncork the champagne. And it's probably one of the most depressing nights of my life. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't talk. And my wife woke up the next day, my wife Rana, and said something that was, well, she is incredibly brilliant and does everything that allows me to do this. She really runs the business and runs everything. She said something that was remarkable and was in tears. And as she was in tears, I learned something about gender that I hadn't fully appreciated, how women projected so much of their ambition on Mrs. Clinton. I supported Mrs. Clinton. I care about Mrs. Clinton, but not to that level, not to that emotive level. She said, if we're this shattered, if we're this broken, Richard, we're advantaged. We live in a nice neighborhood. You teach at the University of Toronto. We have a nice little business. You get to give speeches and write books. If we're this shattered, imagine if Mrs. Clinton had won, what the advocates and devotees of Trump Nation would feel. And I called my publisher, because if anyone saw the galleys of this book, it was a different book. Sometimes reviewers review the galleys, which is hysterical. They're reviewing a book that was never really written. I always encourage them to read the real book. So I called my publisher and said, pull the book back. I have to rewrite it. So then a 7-year project was reduced to 2 weeks, but I did successfully rewrite the book and meet the publication date. And I rewrote it. Because I realized that the new urban crisis was the cause not only of our economic and urban problems, but the cause of our political and cultural divide. It was the central crisis, economic, social, cultural, and political crisis of our time. And I came to realize something Jane Jacobs knew well before me. See, in the book, I called for top-down solutions. I thought if my president won, Justin Trudeau was our leader here in Canada, I thought that we could do top-down solutions. I advocated in the original, it's not in the new version of the book, I make an allusion to this. I said that the United States should set up a President's Council on Cities, equivalent to the National Economic Council, equivalent to the National Security Council, a big deal. And that president, President Clinton, should staff that with leading mayors and urbanists and developers to develop an agenda for reinvestment in cities and overcoming the new urban crisis. But now I knew this was no longer possible and that we had to chart a different road. So what is the new urban crisis? It comes from a very fundamental contradiction. And Jane was the first person to really understand this. And when we would talk in Toronto, she said, you know, I think I made an advance, Richard, humbly she would say this, that is different than most economists and urbanists. She said, most people think that economic growth comes from companies. Think about here. Think about the debates we have here. Competitive, productivity, innovation, where Canada and Toronto lag. It comes from companies. We're losing our large firms. We're being hollowed out. BlackBerry is being replaced by this one. We need to invest in innovation. It comes from R&D and acceleration and incubation. But Jane said, yeah, fine. Where innovation really comes from is from people who come together in communities and cities in that clash and clamor of ideas as we combine and recombine, whether that's in arts, whether that's in music, whether that's in Silicon Valley style innovation. It's out of that clash and clamor of people in small companies and institutions. The city itself is the platform of economic growth, not the firm, not the company. It's clustering that is the source of innovation, enterprise, entrepreneurship, and economic growth. That very clustering, that is the source of economic innovation, the source of productivity enhancement, the source of job generation, economic growth, is the very thing that is carving deep divides in our society. It's a Janus-faced, two-headed monster. And that doesn't mean we should stop clustering and bust apart our cities and stop investing in them. We have to figure out a way to harness this clustering force to make clustering work not against us but for us. We have to make that clustering not create an exclusive kind of prosperity where the advantaged 1% or 10%, in my view, the advantaged third, the creative class of knowledge workers, where this advantaged class gets the lion's share of the benefits, and working people and blue-collar people and service people and hospitality and tourism and retail and clerical work get pushed further and further out and further behind. That's our agenda. And it's one we can accomplish. So what are the dimensions of the new urban crisis, if that's the fundamental contradiction? And it's not economic or class inequality. It's not just a divide between the knowledge workers and the it's an inequality that is reinforced by geography. In fact, I'd encourage you to think about it this way. Economic inequality is bad and it's awful and we have to mitigate this, but spatial inequality is worse. The fact is that we occupy completely distinct and separate world. The urban voter versus Trump nation, the Obama supporter versus Trump nation. We occupy different worlds. We do not come in contact with one another. We are unequal across places and within. The first dimension of the new urban crisis is something I call winner-take-all urbanism. We not only live in a winner-take-all economy, well, in the past 20 years, CEO salaries have grown by 1,000%, and workers' wages have not budged. That's winner-take-all economy. But we also have a winner-take-all urbanism, where London and Paris and Amsterdam and New York and Boston and Seattle and San Francisco, these knowledge and tech hubs, and Toronto and Vancouver, are enormous winners. The statistics on this are terrifying. And this is what has produced Trump and Brexit and Le Pen and the backlash across Europe. The success of winner-take-all cities and the fracturing and fragmenting and falling behind of the rest. In the United States, the 5 largest metros account for 25% of GDP. In Canada, where we think of ourselves as a non-urban country, the 5 largest metros account for 50% of GDP. Toronto, the GTA, accounts for nearly a fifth of our GDP versus 8.9% for New York City. In the United States, the San Francisco Bay Area has increased its share of startups from 20% in 1970. People talk about the rise of the rest. The rest aren't rising so fast. 20% in 1970 to nearly 50% today. In Canada, our startups are clustered in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal in even greater extent. In the United States, the San Francisco Bay Area and the Boston, New York, Washington corridor account for 2/3 of all high-tech startups. The only place other than San Francisco that's increased its level of startup activity and venture is New York City. Think about Toronto. Finance, entertainment, media, and now technology. If you include Waterloo, you have a microcosm of the entire economy in one place. This is just remarkable. I tell this story in real estate terms. By the way, the book is mainly U.S. focused. That's because of U.S. publishers. I apologize in advance. So at the Martin Prosperity Institute, we wrote a separate report, which we released earlier this week, on Canada's new urban crisis. It's online at our site. In the U.S., one apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment in Soho, for the price of that, you can buy 28 single-family homes in Memphis, Tennessee. People think still Toronto is, oh, well, New York and London are expensive. Toronto, no, it's not. When it's $1.5 million for a detached single-family home, it is not affordable. Toronto, according to the most recent data, is the 9th least affordable city in the world on a housing cost-to-income basis. It is less affordable than the New York metro area, comparable to inner city center London, where housing prices are higher, but incomes are higher. The average Torontonian, the cost of their house is now 8 times their income. These are the symptoms of a winner-take-all urbanism, where there is geographic separation between regions. But the second dimension is the winners have their own crisis, the crisis of their own success. And that is seen in growing housing unaffordability. And not just housing unaffordability for the creatives, that's the minor problem. In fact, our research shows that the creative and knowledge class, even with this housing price push, still can survive, even though some young people are being kept out of the market. We don't see any real diminution in creativity and innovation. In fact, in Toronto, in San Francisco, and New York, we see increased creative capacities as formerly artistic and design and finance cities add technology. In the United States, half of all venture capital startups are located now in urban centers. In 2 neighborhoods in San Francisco and downtown, collect more than $1 billion in venture capital a year, investment each. In Toronto, the share of our venture capital investment in the city center, if it's half in the United States, is over 3/4. So these cities are consolidating their advantages and becoming centers of finance, media, entertainment, arts, culture, design, and technology. But the way this shows up, and you know, if it continues, they could become creative dead zones. And certain neighborhoods have certainly become creative dead zones. But the way this shows up is in the segmentation of our society. If the creative class, if the members of the knowledge class, even paying for this extraordinary housing, have $50,000 or $60,000 or in some metros even $80,000 or $90,000 in income left out after paying for their housing, in Canada, the members of the service and blue-collar working class have $15,000 left over. What happens is they are pushed further and further and further out to the periphery. How can you run a city? This is the crisis of the winners. How can you run a city that's this divided, where neighborhoods are no longer cohesive, where service and blue-collar workers have, and you know the math, an hour or 90-minute or more commute? I can tell you this because I travel. There is no place, not even Los Angeles now, that looks like our highways. No place. You can get from LaGuardia or JFK or Reagan National or Dulles or even LAX, never mind Chicago. We have a level of congestion and stymieing of circulation that really now is unmatched. Maybe only Los Angeles is the only place that comes close to us. Then a city begins to break down, and once a metropolitan area hits 5.5 to 6 million, you have to grow differently. Once you get to Toronto size or Miami size or DC size or Boston size or San Francisco Bay Area size, you either invest in transit and density or you break down. You can no longer grow by sprawling and investing in roads. It does not work. To scale to 10 to 15 to 20 million, you have to grow differently. The third dimension of the new urban crisis, and this is why it's so much bigger than the old urban crisis, the crisis of the suburbs, the crisis of Ford Nation, the crisis of the Trump voter. Our suburbs used to be places of affluence, of a Canadian or American dream. They are now sharing in the pathologies of the worst of the old urban crisis. Poverty is bigger and growing faster in the suburbs. Crime is growing. The opioid epidemic. I could go on and on and on. The suburban dimension of the new urban crisis is even bigger than the urban one. That's why it's not just about cities. It's about entire metropolitan regions. My great teacher, the great David Lewis, a Jane Jacobs-like figure of urban design, told me this 20 years ago. He said, Florida, in his incredible South African accent, the cities will be able to revive. They have wonderful infrastructure. They have train stations. They have transit hubs. They have great buildings. Look at your own Newark. Look at what's happening in Detroit and downtown. The suburbs don't have any of that. They're disconnected. They're far away. They have shoddy infrastructure and shoddy homes. And then the biggest dimension, the signature dimension of the new urban crisis, the one that David Holchansky identified here first. If the old urban crisis was about the flight of the middle class to the suburbs, the flight of the middle class from my Newark or Detroit or Pittsburgh, from those great cities, New York City, the flight, it's a great book on the future of New York called Anatomy of a Metropolis, published in around 1959 or 1960. Hoover and Vernon, two great economists. The flight from density. Think about that. The flight from density. We were seeing a flight to the suburbs of the affluent, of the middle class. Our cities were hollowing out, and there was a middle was disappearing. The new urban crisis, its fundamental dimension, is the evisceration of the middle across the board. As David Holchansky pointed out in that remarkable report on the 3 cities of Toronto, which helped me understand the new urban crisis, that and Rob Ford here, it's not just the middle class that's declining. It's something much more important, and this is what we have to help our leaders, municipal leaders, provincial leaders, national leaders understand. It's not just economic inequality, it's spatial inequality. It's geographic isolation. The geographic effects are more. The geographic effects on limiting mobility, on keeping kids down. You know, I'm a great story of economic mobility. I was born in Newark, one of the worst cities and places to grow up in the United States. My parents moved me, Raj Chetty's research shows us, moved me to North Arlington, New Jersey, and put me in a Catholic school in southern Bergen County, they didn't know this, one of the best places for socioeconomic mobility. I got a Garden State scholarship and went to Rutgers and had a life of economic upward mobility. You leave a kid in a place like Newark or a disadvantaged area across the United States or Canada, and there is very little hope now for socioeconomic mobility. There is geographic isolation, which impedes access to everything you need. And we know this, rates of economic mobility across the board, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada, have been severely affected. So what David identified, David Holchansky, it wasn't just a decline in the middle class. It was the decline and evisceration of the middle class neighborhoods, the places that were the platforms for upward mobility, social capital accumulation, a Canadian or American dream. David showed in his work that 2/3 of Torontonians lived in a middle-class neighborhood in the year 1970. By the year 2005, of course, because of the Harper discontinuing our census, by 2005, the last data that we have good data, 30% of Canadians, Torontonians lived in middle-class neighborhoods. The same sorts of declines have happened in Vancouver and Montreal. Well, I trace this for metros across Canada, across the United States, in certain areas of Europe. There'll be a European edition of this book launching in the fall. The statistics for the United States, and think about that. That's going to, for 2005 to 2015, if that's the area of the urban revival, that 30% is going down. So from 2/3 to far less than 30% of Torontonians, as we split into areas of concentrated affluence and wealth, and larger spans of concentrated disadvantage. In the United States, between the year 1970 and today, the share of Americans living in middle-class neighborhoods declined from 2/3 to 40%. And that number is going down. In 203 of 230 metros for which the Pew Data Center has information, 203 of 200 and some, over 9 in 10, the middle class has declined across the United States. The middle class decline has been greatest where? In the largest, densest, most productive, most innovative, most knowledge-intense, most creative class metros in Canada, in the United States, and across the world. We have hollowed out the middle of our economy, and the words city and suburb no longer have any useful meaning. It used to be that there were poor people in cities and rich people in suburbs, and then people said we had an inversion. There were rich people in the city and poor people in the suburbs, but we know that doesn't capture the reality. Yes, maybe in Toronto there are more affluent people in parts of the core, but we still have horribly disadvantaged neighborhoods in the core. Look at a place like New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, Philadelphia, where you walk down the city street and Chicago, you make a wrong turn, you're in an area of concentrated poverty. The suburbs aren't all poor. In Toronto, in New York, in San Francisco, across the United States, Canada, and the world, some of our richest neighborhoods, in fact, our very richest neighborhoods, postal codes, remain in the suburbs. Inequality, geographic inequality, spatial inequality cuts through both. That's why I call it a patchwork region, a patchwork metropolis. It is no longer a class divide based on city and suburb. It's a patchwork, where there are spans of concentrated advantage around the core, around subway and transit hubs, around knowledge institutions. Some of those knowledge institutions, I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ann Arbor, Michigan, a little college town, ranked 4th in the country behind San Francisco, Boston, and Seattle on my creativity index, and it is in the top 10 on the New Urban Crisis Index. So it's not just an urban crisis. It can happen around any kind of knowledge hub, any kind of knowledge cluster, as well as large, dense, propulsive cities. It's the fundamental crisis of our time, as that middle has fallen out. As that middle has fallen out of our society. Think about this. A world, a geography, of small areas of concentrated advantage ensconced, almost like there are invisible barriers around those areas, and sometimes not so invisible, certainly in the United States with the police presence, areas of concentrated wealth and advantage that are growing and growing, where that one house in Soho, one apartment in Soho is equivalent to 28 in Memphis, 50 in Youngstown, where you increasingly have to be a rich person or have the bank of mom and dad to buy in, where those advantages of location are reproduced over time, and then larger and larger spans of concentrated disadvantage. You know what this looks like to me? The third world. To me, it looks like a Latin American city. No, it's not as violent as a Latin American city. No, we don't experience it that way. We don't have to drive to work in an armored car. But its geography, its topography, the falling apart of that middle is terrifying. And that's why we have to move from the old age of winner-take-all urbanism to a fuller and fairer urbanism, to a more inclusive kind of urbanism, to a new era of inclusive prosperity, to a new time of urbanism for all. That's what the last bit of the book is about. Now, we have certain advantages in Canada. One is we don't have Trump. And we have a vertical separation of powers, a federalism that can be very effectively used for this new age. In the United States, I say, cities and metros are going to have to go it alone. They're going to have to go it alone. There will be no hope and no help from the states, which are controlled by increasingly red and conservative, long anti-urban bias. If you think that's here, it's magnified in the states. And the federal government is going to cut, 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 cut. There will be no help left. In Canada, we have an advantage because our federal government can contribute, our provinces can and are contributing, and our cities have pretty darn good leadership. You know, the Ford thing, I think, was a wake-up call for us. And when I look around, and I participate in Mike Bloomberg's, I organized Mike Bloomberg's City Lab conference for him. When I look around at the interesting, especially younger mayors, the Naheed Nenshis, the Don Ivesons, our own John Tory, but when I look around at some of the most interesting younger mayors, the most innovative mayors are coming out of Canadian cities. So we have advantages in our vertical separation of powers that can be reharnessed. What do I think we need to do? The first thing we need to do is build more. Now, we're building a lot here, and we're still not keeping up. And we know that. We need to build more. And we are a model. I know we sometimes self-criticize and self-flagellate. But for Americans, we are a model of building. We still have to build more, because as much as we build, we can't keep up with the demand for our great global spiky city. We have to overcome NIMBYism. We got a lot of NIMBYism, people. New York has its NIMBYism, DC has its NIMBYism, this city has its NIMBYism. I talk in the book when I got hit square in the face. I wrote a little op-ed for the Toronto Star which said, heretically, we should consider having jets at the island airport. I didn't say we should, we must. I said we should consider having jets at the island airport. I don't care how you feel, because maybe this connective fiber was good for us. The hate I got back from my people in the urban community, I was like I was a heretic, that I left Jesus on the cross. Let's have an open conversation about this. We have to consider all the options. If we have the backlash from the right, which is Ford Nation and Trumpism, the backlash from the left is this kind of NIMBYism. Colbert would have said, I got mine. I live in a nice, low-rise, wonderful neighborhood with green face, so screw you. This isn't NIMBYism. This is the new Urban Luddism. The Luddites who smashed the machines were holding back the progress of capitalism. When we hold back urban progress, when we say no to any kind of densification, when we resist this kind of density, we know that cities need density to scale. Now, I'm not saying, like market urbanists, get rid of land use restrictions. I say that we have a scarce number of great urban neighborhoods with the right mid-rise density, with the right collection of refurbishable, repurposable, you know, as Jane said, new ideas require old buildings. Those are in scarce supply. We need to preserve them. But we also need to do density right. We need to commit to a new era of affordable housing. And fortunately, in our city, in our province, we are doing this better than most other places in North America. But we need to turn the dial from single-family home ownership in sprawling suburbs, which is still incentivized, not as bad as the States where there's a mortgage interest tax deduction, but we still create subsidies for roads and so on and so forth. We need to create more incentives for the construction of affordable housing, social housing, rental housing. That's what people need to get a toehold. And when young people, the poor and the working class, can't live in the core, we got a problem. We need to up the game on transit. We will not grow based on roads. No place will grow based on roads. We need to invest in transit. We need to really redouble our efforts there. We need to commit to upgrading service jobs. We need to commit to making those service jobs in which 50% of Canadians and 50% of Torontonians work. We need to make sure that our social safety net is in place for the knowledge age. And then the last thing I'll say, because I'm a professor and I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, so I could go on and on forever. And this is more the case in the United States than here, but it's going to catch up with us, because we are the place where Ford rose and Ford Nation rose. We've got to learn to respect our differences. And that's what the election of Ford and Trump especially, that's what my wife's comment after Mrs. Clinton lost was about. That's why I held out my hand and wrote an opinion piece with my nemesis, Joel Kotkin. We need to respect each other's differences. I may want to live a so-called blue life. I may want to live in a dense urban center, if I'm an American, without guns, with rights for all different kinds of people. And I believe those things are important. I may want to see investment in transit, but you know, there are a lot of other people that don't. We can't force our way on them. And so I think there has to become an increasing recognition at the national level in the divided society that there's not just one way. That people can peacefully coexist by respecting each other's differences. And it's not my way or your way. It's not a Trump way or a Clinton way. It's not a Ford or a Nenshi way. I could go on and on. It's everyone. And by doing that, we have to devolve more and more power to the local level. We have to make sure people feel that they can control their neighborhoods, they control their cities. And here, Toronto has a big advantage, and Canada has a big advantage, because our federal government is weaker, and our provinces are stronger. Our cities are still not strong enough. But our federal government is weaker than the imperial presidency and overblown nation state of the United States. And I think to put this in perspective, I think more is coming our way. And this is why we have to double down. With Trump in office in the United States, Toronto, this city faces probably the greatest opportunity in its young life. I can tell you, I don't have any of this confirmed, but I can tell you, because I'm in the States a lot on book tour, more and more of America's leading technology companies, leading knowledge institutions, are looking for ways around Trump's immigration restrictions, are looking for places outside the United States that are close by and easily connectable, that they can put people they need to run those businesses that come from other countries. The pressures on Toronto from this very growth of a global city, from this incredible boom of urban revival, this opportunity is going to get bigger and the problems are going to get worse. It's time that we up our game, that we double down, that we understand that we have been at the height of the urban revival and perhaps the biggest beneficiary, and redouble our efforts to move from winner-take-all urbanism to a more inclusive prosperity for all. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your work to build this here in our great city of Toronto. Thank you, guys.
How are you? Good to see you. Good morning.
Well, the Premier doesn't need my introduction, but she's had a long and distinguished career.
That means I'm old.
I think I'm older
that what
than
you're
you.
saying?
I think I'm older than you. I was born in 1957. That's the way I'll give it away.
You're 4 years younger than I am.
You look great. You look great. Wow. You look great. She's our 25th Premier. Our 25th Premier. She served in so many positions of public service for our province and in Toronto, on the Toronto District School Board. She's a local organizer. She understands this. She has this in her blood. And I just wanted to say congratulations to the Premier and to your chief, Mary Rowe. Mary, you know, by the way, is the person who introduced me to Jane Jacobs way back when, before I moved and had a big impact on our moving to Toronto. Mary and you and your team, your staff, and this is honest, thank you for taking this thing of inclusive prosperity and making it a set of policy and pragmatic initiatives. And you've really, I know you've always cared about this, but it seems like in the past couple of weeks, wherever I am in the States on book tour, I see something new. I see affordable housing. I see investment. I see now the basic guaranteed income. It blew me away yesterday. So tell us a little more in your vocabulary about why, I don't want to call it a shift, maybe that's the wrong word, but what brought you, I come to this intellectually, we need inclusive prosperity, but you've come to this programmatically in defining an inclusive prosperity agenda around housing, transit, I call for basic income, guaranteed income. What has motivated the shift, and what do you see as its biggest and most important contours?
So, first of all, you know, what we're doing now really builds on what we have done for many years. So, when I became the leader, I was building on a foundation that had been put in place since 2003. I was convinced that building infrastructure was critical. I had been the Minister of Transportation as one of my roles, and I had seen the bones of the province sort of crumbling across all our municipalities, and recognized that municipalities needed support. But on top of that, the building of transit needed to be accelerated. And so, you know, that $160 billion, we're in about the 4th year of spending $160 billion on infrastructure over 12 years. And that is it's about transit, it's about roads, it's about bridges, but it's about schools and hospitals too. So I was really convinced that building that, literally, that foundation was critical. I also ran on improving retirement security. Yep. You know, that our retirement security, our Canada Pension Plan was not adequate, and we needed to do something about that. And we pushed, and we've got an enhanced retirement security plan. So from my perspective, this is the work that I've been doing all along. It's why I got into politics. You know, I got into politics because I was worried about what was happening to our publicly funded education system. So now where we are, we're moving into a balanced budget. We'll be bringing out a budget on Thursday. And the responsibility that a balanced budget actually affords is to continue to make those investments that people need. You know, whether it is the basic income pilot, which is, again, that's something that's been talked about for 30 years, not on the left, not on the right, but both sides of the political spectrum. And the imperative is even greater now, because we've got a technological revolution that is displacing more people, and there are way more questions about what work's going to look like. So from my perspective, Richard, this is about the next step in ensuring that we have economic viability and prosperity that includes everyone. And I'll just end this piece by saying that I've talked about an inclusive economy for many years now. You know, I don't think we can just talk about the numbers on the page and the fiscal health of the province without talking about whether people have childcare, whether they are able to take part in the economy, whether they have access to education. For example, having free tuition for low-income families. So for me, it's all of a piece.
So I want to thank you for this, because it makes me proud to be a Torontonian and an Ontarian. Certainly helped me recover from the Ford days. But I think I can now use Ontario as an example to the world. You know, not only are U.S. cities cutting back in the federal government, U.S. states are cutting back, and most of them are controlled by a red, if you will, a right-wing legislature, and in many cases a governor who's cutting back. So this is really important, and our education system still stands as a crown jewel, certainly as someone who came here from the States, where that's what drives people out of the cities, the middle class. One thing I wanted to ask you about a little further, because you mentioned transit, is we seem to face two kinds of inequality, two kinds of gaps in Ontario. The first one I talked about a little bit this morning is the widening inequality, the decline of the middle class neighborhoods in the great cities, the spiky cities, the winter cities like Toronto. So that's one part of transit. How do we connect our areas? But the other thing that you have to confront, because you are a premier, not the mayor of Toronto, is we are a microcosm of spatial inequality. We have the Torontos that are the big winners, if you will, even with their own problems. And then we have those declining, I talked about Detroit and Pittsburgh, but my God, Windsor. And how do you see transit maybe, or rail, or is there a way to use the transit file? You know, I've advocated for high-speed rail, that's one thing I think about, to not only make Toronto function better and bring the outlying areas in, but how could we maybe help our province and these declining places connect? Can we help them by connecting them better to our hub cities like Toronto?
Well, there's a huge demand for that, and people see that as a solution to their economic challenges. And it's why we asked David Collinette to do a study and to look at high-speed rail, basically Toronto through to Windsor. We've got his report. We're going to be putting it out very soon, because he makes a business case for that in a phased way. And I'm a big proponent of getting that done. We're already doing an environmental assessment. And, you know, our challenge, when people say, well, look at China, look what China can do, you have to look at the numbers of people, the bums in the seats, and how do we make it work? And that's what we've asked David to do. But I think that there's a huge potential for that. The GO Regional Express Rail is about that. You know, it's about intercity connectivity and making sure that we understand that there are as many people going out of Toronto to go to work as there are coming in the GTHA, and keep tabs on that and make sure that we have those investments in place. So I think there's a huge role for that intercity connectivity to play. I also think that the work that we've been doing to help municipalities to invest in their own transit, because it's not just the fact of the transit that we're talking about. It's also a mindset. I was listening on my way down, and you were talking about suburbs and the way suburbs were built. I grew up in a suburb of Toronto. I grew up in Richmond Hill, and nobody took a bus in Richmond Hill. It just wasn't part of our consciousness. And I remember when my kids were in their teens being stunned that none of the 3 kids was eager to get their driver's license. Yep. We lived 5 minutes from the Lawrence subway station, and so it didn't occur to them to get their driver's license. I can tell you, in Richmond Hill, in 1969, everybody was looking to get their driver's license, you know? And so there's a mindset, and it's one of the things that is really challenging about getting people to think about taking transit, using transit. It's got to be more convenient than driving the car, and right now it's not.
And I think to be honest, we suffer from this more than most. You know, when I go to New York and I go to JFK or LaGuardia or Newark, my hometown, and the airport, very few people are driving the car alone. There's a lot of black cars, there's a lot of cabs, and a lot of trucks. But here, when you come in from the airport, you see it. It's a lot of solo commuters. Yeah. So how can we? I know it's more of a psychological thing. How can we shift? I think it's a big part of it. Investment in transit, investment in rail. How do we shift this mindset that we're no longer a growing suburban? Because we were until very recently, up to we got 5.5, 6 million. We could do that. We could grow by expanding externally. How can we engage that shift to a mindset that transit and rail has to become much more of the way we grow?
Well, I think the building of it and getting it to a point where it's actually more convenient to get on a bus or get on a train than it is to drive your car. I don't think there's any other way. And one of the challenges with building infrastructure, and so many people in this room know that, until people see the reality, it's really hard to imagine. And so it takes time. And one of the reasons that governments have historically not made these investments, I'm convinced, is that I'm not going to get to cut the ribbon on everything that we're investing in. You know, it's a long-term challenge, and so you have to take that leap of faith and make those investments. It takes time. It takes time to get those things built. It especially takes time when you're building in a built-up area. You know, we're not talking about greenfield builds for the most part. The other thing that we have done, and there are many discussions about this right now because the plan is just undergoing a review, but our growth plan to incent density and to push that different kind of building, and you were talking a bit about that, respecting differences. We do have to respect differences, but we also have to recognize that we have to use land differently, and we have to look at a different range of kinds of housing that are acceptable to people. And I know that Western Europe is not the comparator necessarily, but people go to New York and love New York. Look at the density in New York, you know? And here, that kind of density is opposed consistently. So again, we're fighting those attitudes, and that's not a denigration of any particular attitude. It's just a statement of fact that those are the challenges that we're facing.
No, and you're right. And people come here from many places across the world with this dream of having their house and having their patch and having their car. That's what success means to them. So we're going to have to respect that some people still want that, while others are willing to live more densely and want the amenities that come with that. And we have to make that shift, or else we'll just seize up. You know, I've been on the road a lot, and you have done this. I wanted people to know that the Premier and her staff have done this independently. I've had no role in this. Maybe you've appreciated something I've written. I would be grateful, thankful. But so I'm really curious. I'm really curious, especially, and I think the audience is as well. The housing strategy is really fascinating and important. How did you get to it? And really, because I tried to read, but there's so many dimensions. How did you get to this new strategy? What are its key dimensions, and how do you see it rolling out in the future?
So you're talking about our fair housing plan,
Exactly.
Dealing with the housing, yeah. So not easy. We heard lots of voices in terms of how do we cool a market? How do we make sure that we put balanced initiatives in place? For me, it was really important that if we're going to put in place rent control and extend it beyond buildings that were built up to 1991, we need to make sure that there are still enough incentives in place for building of purpose-built rental to happen. And so, vacancy decontrol hasn't been removed, and there still are above guideline increases if landlords are investing. And we're putting in place some subsidies for development charges to make it clear that we need more rental housing. We need that kind of building to happen. When we looked at all of the different voices about the housing affordability market, I was at first not a fan of a foreign buyer tax, and as the conversation continued, the speculative aspect of that, the people who weren't interested in coming and living here, but were just interested in parking money and buying property, that became more compelling to me. And so that's why the emphasis is on speculation and non-residency. If people want to come here and live here, buy property, that's how this province was built. But that speculative aspect. So, to be honest, Richard, it's one aspect of housing. The other aspect is getting supply built, getting the right supply built, and making sure that we work with the private sector to build the kind of housing that people can afford. Inclusionary zoning is one of the aspects of this. Like, how do we change the mindset around providing for affordable housing? I mean, that is a big challenge without necessarily talking only about social housing. That's one part of it, but affordable housing that allows people to get into the market, that for me is a big piece of this plan.
So I want to draw a thread for this crowd, ULI crowd, real estate developers. We are working with a developer in Washington, D.C., and this developer has said they want to help move the needle from just inclusionary zoning to inclusionary prosperity. I want to get your ideas on this, and I want the audience to have a takeaway. The idea is that we could trade density, not only for affordable housing units, but for a developer taking on the role of an anchor, like a Meds and Eds, but a real anchor, especially with these large-scale district developments that we're seeing across the world, and get offset not only for affordable housing, but for providing better jobs. You have your basic income, which is incredible. But the idea is if you will work with your tenants to create better service jobs, if you'll work with retail, hospitality, whatever it is, the mix, food prep, service companies, grocery stores, and say, okay, instead of the crappy job, the low-wage, minimum precarious job, we're going to work together to make those service jobs better. I always say my dad had a crappy job in manufacturing when he started in the 30s, came back from World War II because of collective bargaining, unionization, a New Deal. He had a great job.
Right.
We made manufacturing good jobs. Is there a way, whether it's inclusionary zoning, but whatever, is there a way that you see that we can begin to turn the tide to upgrade the 50% of our jobs? We got a third of good jobs in the knowledge. We still have a manufacturing base here that's very strong, stronger than most places in Ontario. But we have all these service jobs. Is there a way that you can think of or we could work on to make those service jobs, which are now the precarious contingent jobs, low-wage jobs, better jobs?
So the two things that you talked about in there, one was the co-location, so that hub notion, that how do we have a better interaction between public dollars, private dollars, and that space. And I'm a big fan of that kind of synergy. And I think that gap, because you're talking about the loss of the middle, right?
Yep.
And I don't have the answer to this. If you don't have it, I don't have it. You're way smarter than I am. So,
no, I'm not.
But I do believe that as we wring our hands about the number of service jobs that we are confronting, many of which are filled by women, And so we have to look at that too. What's the gendered reality here?
Right.
How willing are we as a society to look at a wage gap and figure out how do we close that middle by saying, well, actually, women and men should be paid equally well, and these jobs, which are necessary to our society, should be better paid. How do we distribute the wealth so that, in fact, that happens? I think that is a fundamental question.
So I pledge to work with you on this. I think it's critical. We have our next major report from the University of Toronto is on this, and you are absolutely right. They are majority women and majority minority. And this has been a big part of the problem. I think, as we've led on these other elements of inclusive prosperity, you know, David Miller, when he was mayor, had embraced this agenda. I think we can do it. One last question. We're over time. Yes, and then I have one last question.
Yep. But let me just use an example of a job that is almost exclusively, not completely exclusively, but almost exclusively done by women, and that's personal support workers. Absolutely. And with an aging demographic, I mean, we made a decision 2 budgets ago to put more money in the hands of personal support workers because we looked at the traditionally male professions and we saw a trajectory like this on their salaries over 10 years. We looked at personal support workers, early childhood educators, developmental support workers. They were flatlined. So we actually intentionally, as government, said we're going to put more money into those lines and we're into the hands of those people. Those are jobs that are, if they disappeared, if those women started doing that work, we would be in chaos.
Yep.
Chaos, complete, and it will only get worse as people my age, at this
our age,
as we age. So you know, why do we pay a personal support worker, an early childhood educator, the wages that we pay them? Why are they only worth? Okay, this goes back a long time in my life to why the hell is women's work paid the way it is when it is so fundamental? Those are the people who are caring for our parents and our grandparents, the people we love and have loved our whole lives, and our grandchildren who are the people who are giving us hope about the future. So I think that that's the conversation that we have to have. And you may have heard in my speech yesterday when I was talking about basic income, I was talking about how do we make this precarious work less precarious? What is it that we have to do in terms of the workplace and labor relations and our understanding of what good work is or is not? What is the role of government in changing the rules that have been in place for decades to make sure that that those jobs are respected?
I can tell you I've got the business school working on this. I've got my colleague Roger Martin working on this, and they have the CEO's ears. And we believe that we can convince the business community that upgrading service work isn't just a do-good, but it will add productivity and it will add to profit. And Roger has become a disciple. But the line I use on this, it's so funny, we've never talked about this. The line I use in this in the book, I can't remember it exactly, but it goes something like this. We decided as a society to pay the people who make our cars and washing machines and refrigerators a good wage.
Yeah.
We now need to decide who's more important to you. The person who makes your refrigerator or car, fine. Or the person who takes care of your aging parents or your kids. What you're saying is a no-brainer.
Well, and
it's a no-brainer.
From my perspective, let's not make a value judgment. They're equally important. You know, they're equally important because in the one case, the guy or the woman who's building the car is supporting a family, and that's fantastic. Right. But so is the person who's looking after your family.
And so one last question, and of course it's kind of the elephant in the room, but I got to ask it because I'm the urbanist here. And I talked about this, the vertical separation of powers, our federalistic system we have in Canada. They have one in the United States, but in the United States, look, most of the power is in the hands of Trump. Sorry. But it really was a rude awakening for me that consolidating that much power in a country of 350 million people with 3,000 municipalities makes no sense. So bring it down. One of the advantages we have is really Ontario is a country, if you will. It's as big as a country, it has the land of a country, and it has much more power relative to a U.S. state. But the elephant in the room is our cities here, our metros, are relatively less empowered. And so there's a debate. There's a very robust dialogue about how do we, and we can, one of the nice things about the vertical separation of powers is they're amenable to adjustment. We're not stuck with just a king, you know what I'm saying? They're amenable to adjustment. How do you see this as someone who is an urbanist, comes from a local organizer background, is from Toronto, big Richmond Hill, suburb, right, in a metro area. How do you see this adjustment process of a province and the cities and adjusting and empowering our localities, and not just our localities, our neighborhoods, our communities, or our metros when appropriate? How do you see this adjustment of our federalist system to create a governance, really, we're talking about a governance system for a inclusive prosperity in today's economy?
Yeah, and this is a fundamental question in terms of the relationship, and it's actually a fundamental question of our government. We came into office and followed a government that had been incredibly disrespectful of the local municipalities and their governments. And you know, one of the things I wanted to be part of was a government that was going to change that relationship. And to a large extent, I think that we have. I think there's a fundamental question, and I know there are a lot of people in this room who are mad at me because I said no to tolls at the City of Toronto. I get that, but the reason that that happened is that there had been no regional consensus. There'd been no regional conversation about it, and you know, what I was caught in, because philosophically I'm supportive of local autonomy. I think that it's a very good thing. I was part of, and I look at Richard Joy, I was part of pushing under the previous premier for a City of Toronto Act and getting that started. But I think that the conundrum we have right now is, what's the regional consciousness? How do we have the regional discussion? We've got upper tier and lower tier municipal governments, and how do we make sense of that? And I think that you know, I've gathered the regional mayors on a regular basis, the GTHA mayors, but we haven't necessarily had the discussion about how do we formalize that? How does that become a bigger conversation? So I think that's where we need to go. I am completely of the belief that decisions need to be made locally. And I'll give you an example. Right now, we're in the process of reviewing and overhauling the Ontario Municipal Board. And my belief about the Ontario Municipal Board has been that it should only exist to deal with issues that cannot be or should not be dealt with at the local level, that way more decisions should be made by local municipalities. At the same time, we have developers coming and saying, yeah, but if local municipalities don't want to build the density that we know we need, and not just so that they can make money, but so that it's actually, we have compliance with the growth plan and that we actually see that density moving forward, then how do we deal with that? So that conundrum of a system that has not allowed for that autonomy, shifting to one that does allow for the autonomy, that's a challenge, because there are some learned behaviors, Richard, in terms of, well, it's your fault. Actually, you know, municipal councillors saying, well, it's the OMB's fault. Well, yeah, but if you made your decisions in accordance with your official plan and the provincial policy statement, you wouldn't need to be going to the OMB. That kind of debate is what we're having now. So I want to have that regional discussion, and I want municipalities to do everything they can do and be responsible for their future. At the same time, I want us to have rational planning. I want us to have good transit planning. And so we're in the throes of that right now.
And I want to emphasize this, that there is no easy answer here. And I think your approach to this is exactly right. It is a conversation. And oftentimes we may be different on a singular issue, whether it's congestion charges and pricing roads or an island. There can be many things, a densification of one project here or there. But to have the open conversation, because getting this governance thing right, it's not as simple as all to the city, all to the province. The governance has to scale, as you said, to the problem. There are some problems that are best dealt with at the neighborhood level, some problems that are best dealt with the municipal level, some problems where you're talking about a coalition of metro government, and some problems which deal with the provincial. And getting that right, and maybe it's never exactly right, maybe it's constantly in some kind of dynamic balance. And most of all, Premier, I want to thank you, because you know, I told the audience, I've been traveling all over the place for this darn book and engaging mayors and governors. And they're coming to where you are. They are struggling with this idea of how do they get to an inclusive prosperity agenda. And I know you've known this your whole life, you embody it. But what you have done recently to advance this plan, this set of cascades of initiatives, from transit to affordable housing and fair housing to now a basic income, not only gives us something that we should and can be proud of in a conversation, but it's really something that that I, as an Ontarian, can take on the road and say, look what the Premier, look what folks in Ontario are doing. This can be done, and it creates hope. It really creates hope in very dark times in the United States that there is a way to embrace this future. So for that and for your leadership and guidance, I want to thank you. And thank you for agreeing to take place in this very open, candid dialogue with me.
Pleasure.
I appreciate it, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Do you want us to send it?
Okay.
So I'm also going to do a very quick thank you. I'm Emma West. I'm a partner at the planning and urban design firm of Bousfields. I'm also the vice chair and chair of mission advancement for ULI Toronto. And this conversation has been really important to us because it really works with our mission at ULI for the responsible use of land, but also thinking about inclusiveness and diversity, including our Women's Leadership Initiative, which you alluded to. And so we thank both the Premier and Professor Florida for the time and the conversation, because it's really important that we have these discussions and bring different perspectives sometimes, and ULI plays an important role in that. So a quick message to say that your next session starts at 9:30, so please be there on time. And Professor Florida will be out in the foyer for a book signing. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Emma.
Awesome.